On the 6th of August, 2026, the United States Central Command posted a single line on its official channels that summed up months of quiet, grinding confrontation in one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. 49 commercial vessels redirected, 2 disabled, 2 boarded and inspected. No headline explosion, no missile strike, just a running tally of ships being turned away one after another from the Strait of Hormuz. To understand why that single sentence matters, it helps to go back further than April, to the roots of the conflict itself. The current crisis didn't begin in a vacuum. It traces back to the collapse of nuclear negotiations in Geneva in early 2025, talks that failed to produce any consensus on limiting Iranian uranium enrichment. Tensions kept building through that year, and in June 2025, Israel launched what it called Operation Rising Lion, a strike campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities, in a period now referred to as the 12-Day War. A fragile ceasefire held through the following winter. It broke on February 28, 2026, when joint American and Israeli military operations against Iran began in earnest, the opening move of what's now called the 2026 Iran War, and the event that put the Strait of Hormuz at the center of global attention. That number, 49, is not the whole story. It's the latest entry in a ledger that started back in April, and to understand why an American command is now tracking merchant ships the way an air traffic controller tracks planes, you have to go back to how this started. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a choke point so narrow that at its tightest point the shipping lanes are only a couple of miles wide. On an ordinary day, before any of this began, roughly 100 merchant vessels would pass through it, carrying something close to a quarter of the world's seaborne oil. That single fact is why every escalation here moves markets, and why a warning issued by CENTCOM doesn't stay a regional story for long. The scale of what's riding on that narrow stretch of water is hard to overstate. Analysis published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas put daily flow through the strait at around 20% of global oil consumption before the war, something close to 20 million barrels a day. Economists Lutz Kilian, Michael Plant, Alexander Richter, and Xiaoqing Zhou, writing in a paper distributed by the Dallas Fed and summarized on the Center for Economic Policy Research's website, described a full closure of Hormuz as a disruption 2 to 3 times larger than either the 1973 oil crisis or the Gulf War disruption of 1990. The largest geopolitical oil supply shock on record by their measure. Their modeling suggested that even a one-quarter closure of the strait could push U.S. headline inflation up by roughly 0.6 of a percentage point in 2026, with core inflation rising about 0.2 of a point. And separate Dallas Fed research estimated that a strait closure removing that much supply from the market could cut global real GDP growth by close to 3 percentage points on an annualized basis in the second quarter of the year alone. The markets didn't wait for the economists to publish before reacting. According to figures tracked by financial and energy outlets in the days immediately after the February 28th strikes, Brent crude, the main international oil benchmark, jumped from around $72 a barrel to over $84 within 5 trading days, and some accounts had crude spiking as high as $115 a barrel within the first week, as fears about the strait spread through trading floors in London, New York, and Singapore. Reuters reported at the time that tanker operators and major energy companies had temporarily suspended shipments of crude oil, refined fuels, and liquefied natural gas through the waterway after Tehran warned vessels about transiting the area, a halt driven as much by insurers pulling coverage and shipping lines imposing steep war risk surcharges as by any single attack. The Kilian, Plant, Richter, and Zhou research modeled monthly average WTI crude peaking near $94 a barrel in April and May of 2026, staying above $80 for the rest of the year under a plausible scenario. That volatility hasn't been a one-time spike either. Al Jazeera reported that in early July, Brent crude rose more than 3% in a single day, crossing $76 a barrel, as renewed hostilities reversed a slide that had briefly brought prices back toward pre-war levels, a reminder that every fresh CENTCOM advisory or Iranian threat still moves the price of oil in real time, months after the war first began. That's the economic backdrop sitting behind every CENTCOM statement about redirected ships. It isn't simply a matter of ship traffic and naval posture. It's a choke point carrying a meaningful share of the energy the global economy runs on, at a moment when insurers, central banks, and oil-importing nations are all watching the same narrow stretch of water CENTCOM is trying to police. The current chapter opened in late February 2026, when U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iran triggered what's now referred to as the 2026 Iran War. Iran responded in part by asserting control over shipping through the strait, threatening vessels, and in some cases, attacking them. In early April, the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. President Trump said at the time that the truce was conditioned on what he called the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Some ships did move through. Then Iran halted traffic again, this time in response to Israeli strikes in Lebanon. By April 13th, with ceasefire talks in Islamabad having collapsed, President Trump ordered a full U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, blocking vessels from entering or leaving, with an exception carved out for humanitarian aid. According to figures compiled by the Congressional Research Service, that initial blockade phase, which ran through mid-June, saw CENTCOM redirect more than 140 ships and disable 9 that didn't comply. The first day alone tells you how this was meant to work without gunfire. According to reporting from NBC News, citing a U.S. official, American warships issued warnings to about 10 vessels in the earliest hours of the blockade, and every one of them turned around. No shots were fired. No boarding took place. At least 5 of those ships were carrying oil. The U.S. had over a dozen ships stationed in the Gulf of Oman at that point, backed by more than 100 fighter and surveillance aircraft, using radar and airborne surveillance to identify vessels leaving Iranian ports and waters, then hailing them over radio before they got close enough for anything to go wrong. That's the pattern that's held for months now. Warn first and let the ship decide. But warnings only work if the other side listens, and Iran has made clear repeatedly that it doesn't intend to. On May 3rd, President Trump announced what he called Project Freedom, a plan to guide stranded commercial vessels through the strait via a safer, more southern route that kept them further from Iranian waters. Iran's response came fast. Ali Abdullahi, head of the Iranian military's unified command, said U.S. forces would be attacked if they entered the strait, and warned commercial ships and oil tankers not to move at all unless they coordinated directly with Iran. Around the same time, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency raised its threat assessment for the strait to critical, telling mariners to consider routing through Oman's territorial waters instead, where the US had set up what it called an enhanced security area. A tanker off Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates was reportedly hit by unknown projectiles around that same period. The crew was unharmed and no environmental damage was reported, according to UKMTO. Then, in late May, the warning sharpened into something more specific. On May 29th, CENTCOM issued an advisory through the Joint Maritime Information Center. Not a general caution this time, but a direct statement about mines. Iran continues to attempt to impede mine clearance and safe transit of the Strait of Hormuz, the advisory read, according to Bloomberg's reporting. Where any vessel observed to be engaged in or supporting mine-laying activities will be targeted by U.S. forces in self-defense. That's about as close as a military advisory gets to telling every ship in the water, "We are watching," and there is a line here that ends in force, not just a diverted course. It's worth pausing on why mines specifically triggered that language. Sea mines are cheap, hard to detect, and don't require Iran to risk a warship or an aircraft to use them. For a narrow choke point like Hormuz, even the credible threat of mines can be enough to spike insurance premiums and slow global oil shipments without a single vessel actually being hit. CENTCOM's advisory was as much about deterring that tactic as it was about responding to any single incident. Behind the scenes, there was also a brief window where diplomacy looked like it might actually hold. According to the Congressional Research Service, a memorandum of understanding reached between the United States and Iran in June 2026 included a U.S. commitment to issue waivers, allowing the export of Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and associated services like banking, insurance, and transportation. Now, on June 21st, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control followed through, issuing what's known as General License X, described by the Congressional Research Service as the most expansive energy sector sanctions license issued against Iran since oil sanctions first began. For a couple of weeks, in other words, there was an actual legal pathway back toward normal Iranian oil exports. It didn't last. On July 7th, in direct response to renewed Iranian attacks on commercial vessels near the strait, OFAC revoked General License X entirely, replacing it with a much narrower License X1 that only allowed transactions needed to wind down what had already been authorized. That reversal came exactly 1 week before CENTCOM's restrictions resumed on July 14th. The two events track each other closely enough that the timeline speaks for itself, even though CENTCOM's own statements didn't explicitly link the two. Iran's own position, at the political level, hasn't been ambiguous about wanting a return to the way things were before the war. The Congressional Research Service noted that Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, said in June that management of the strait would never go back to what it was before the conflict. A statement that lines up with what's actually happened on the water. Iran continuing to require coordination, inspection, and a narrow coastal corridor for any vessel that wants to pass. The broader response to the initial closure was, by some measures, the largest coordinated energy intervention in history. In the second week of the war, with the strait effectively closed and roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply cut off, the International Energy Agency coordinated a release of 412 million barrels of strategic reserves from 32 member countries over 4 months, according to analysis published by The Conversation. The United States alone committed 172 million barrels from its own strategic petroleum reserve, according to CNBC and confirmed in a Government Accountability Office review. pulling the U.S. reserve down from roughly 350 million barrels in early June to around 243 million barrels once the release was fully executed, against an authorized storage capacity of 714 million barrels. Government auditors flagged that the reserve's physical infrastructure, built decades ago and already showing its age, is straining under releases now larger and more frequent than anything it was designed for, even as the Department of Energy pushes ahead with a $1 billion-plus repair program. None of that reserve oil solved the underlying problem. As one energy consultant told CNBC, the releases could blunt the sharpest price spikes, but couldn't replace the roughly 10 million barrels a day the closed strait was holding back. It bought time and moderated the shock. It didn't end it. And it came at a cost to the reserve itself. Government Accountability Office auditors noted that the emergency stockpile, first established by Congress back in 1975 after the 1973 Arab oil embargo, has now been drawn down twice in 4 years to levels not seen since the 1980s, leaving less cushion available should another disruption hit before it's rebuilt, even as the Department of Energy works through a repair program to keep the reserve's aging pipelines and storage caverns functional under the strain of these larger, more frequent drawdowns than the system was originally built to handle. By mid-June, that first blockade phase wound down, but it didn't stay down for long. According to Shafaq News, citing CENTCOM, maritime restrictions around Iran resumed on July the 14th. Iran, for its part, kept tight control over shipping through the strait, requiring vessels to coordinate their transit with Iranian authorities, submit to inspection, and hold to a narrow corridor running along the Iranian coastline, one that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps continued to monitor closely. The human cost of this hasn't been limited to the naval standoffs either. According to reporting from The National, Iran's resumption of tanker attacks in mid-July, including strikes on 2 supertankers, registered in the United Arab Emirates, killed at least 1 sailor, and roughly 6,000 seafarers were reported trapped in the region as a result of the disruption, with the International Maritime Organization working to evacuate stranded crews through whatever safe routes could be arranged. That's a detail that tends to get lost in a story dominated by warship movements and oil price charts. The people actually crewing the tankers, container ships, and bulk carriers caught in the middle of this have had to weigh their own safety against contracts and cargo that, in many cases, they have no control over. One specific incident from that same period illustrates just how quickly this can escalate on the water. In a statement carried by Iranian state media in mid-July and reported by NPR, Iran's Navy said it had fired warning shots that struck a Cyprus-flagged container vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, after what Iran described as several ships attempting to travel along an unapproved route. That report came from Iranian state media specifically. It wasn't independently confirmed by CENTCOM or by a named Western official in the same reporting, which is exactly the kind of claim this analysis is treating as reported rather than verified. What is independently documented is that the same week saw the U.S. and Iran exchange fire for a 3rd consecutive weekend, with strikes continuing into the following Monday as Iran targeted U.S. allies in the broader region in response to renewed American attacks. A reminder that whatever happens, specifically in the Strait of Hormuz, rarely stays contained to the Strait of Hormuz alone. 4 days after that restart, on July 18th, came one of the more serious individual incidents of the year. The USS Boxer, an amphibious assault ship, shot down an Iranian drone in the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump described the action as defensive, saying the drone had come within 1,000 yards of the vessel and had failed to respond to repeated warnings. Tehran denied losing any aircraft at all, a direct contradiction that, as of this recording, remains unresolved between the two sides. It's a useful reminder that not everything in this conflict gets confirmed by both parties, and where that's true, it has to be treated as contested, not settled. Which brings the story back to where it opened, August 6th in CENTCOM's running count. Since restrictions resumed on July 14th, the command says it has redirected 49 commercial vessels, disabled 2, and boarded and inspected 2 others. CENTCOM didn't release further detail on those specific incidents. What it did confirm is that Marine Corps aviation assets and personnel embarked aboard USS Boxer are actively supporting enforcement of the blockade against Iran, meaning the same ship involved in the drone shoot-down weeks earlier is still on station, still part of the effort to manage traffic through the Strait of Hormuz without it turning into open combat. And just 2 days before that update, on August 4th, Iran issued its most direct threat yet. Mohsen Rezai, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader, told Iranian state media that Tehran would not allow what he called a second corridor to open, a likely reference to the kind of southern routing the U.S. has been trying to establish. Even if they deploy warships, we will target them, Rezai said, according to reporting picked up by Euronews. He went further, warning of what he called serious dangers to U.S. ships and bases if the naval blockade continued. It's important to be precise about what that is and isn't. It's a statement from a senior Iranian official, carried by Iranian state media. It has not been independently verified as reflecting an operational order, and no U.S. ship has reported being targeted as a direct result of it as of this recording. It sits in the category of a threat, not a confirmed event, and treating it as anything more than that would be getting ahead of the facts. There's another number worth putting alongside the oil price, one that gets less attention, but explains a lot about why ships are willing to be redirected rather than pushed through: insurance. Before the war, according to reporting from the World Economic Forum, an average of 178 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Since the war began, that traffic has reportedly dropped by around 95%, not because every ship was ordered to stop, but because for long stretches, many simply couldn't get insured to make the trip. Standard marine insurance explicitly excludes losses from war, mines, and military action, so any vessel entering the strait needs separate war risk coverage on top of its normal policy. According to Marcus Baker, global head of marine, cargo, and logistics at the insurance broker Marsh, speaking to S&P Global's Platts, additional war risk premiums in the region jumped from around 1 to 3% of a ship's hull value earlier in the summer to somewhere between 7.5% and 10% by late July. Al Jazeera, citing that same S&P Global reporting, put a dollar figure on what that means in practice. Insuring a single large crude tanker carrying 270,000 metric tons could run to around $21 million, just for the war risk portion of the policy for one transit. Baker also noted something counterintuitive about how the market was behaving. Fewer ships attempting the crossing meant fewer potential targets overall, but also, in his words, a possible concentration of opportunity for Iran if it chose to strike one of the ships still willing to make the run. Governments have had to step in where private insurers pulled back. In March, the insurance giant Chubb agreed to serve as lead partner on a $20 billion maritime reinsurance plan backed by the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, specifically aimed at getting commercial shipping moving through the Gulf again by offering war risk coverage for hull, cargo, and liability when the private market wouldn't. That kind of government-backed insurance backstop is itself a signal of how serious the disruption became. When a choke point carrying a fifth of the world's oil effectively becomes uninsurable on the open market, it stops being purely a shipping story and starts being a story about which governments are willing to absorb risk that private markets no longer will. None of this is entirely without precedent either. The Congressional Research Service report that documents much of this year's blockade timeline includes an appendix specifically comparing it to the U.S.-Iran conflict in the Gulf during the 1980s, a period known to historians as the Tanker War, when Iran and Iraq, then locked in their own war, both began attacking neutral shipping in the Gulf. The United States responded in 1987 by agreeing to reflag Kuwaiti oil tankers under the American flag and providing naval escorts, an operation known as Earnest Will, so that attacks on those vessels would draw a direct U.S. military response. That earlier confrontation produced its own dangerous incidents, including the 1987 attack on the USS Stark by an Iraqi jet that killed 37 American sailors, and the 1988 shoot-down of an Iranian civilian airliner by the USS Vincennes, which killed all 290 people aboard, after the ship's crew misidentified the aircraft as a hostile military target. That history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it's part of why the U.S. military treats warnings, hailing procedures, and clear rules of engagement in the Strait as seriously as it does today. The cost of getting an identification wrong in these waters has a documented tragic precedent. Beyond the Strait itself, the war has also reached onshore energy infrastructure elsewhere in the Gulf. Reporting compiled by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas noted that the conflict has involved attacks on oil infrastructure in neighboring countries, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, meaning the disruption to global energy supply hasn't been confined strictly to shipping lanes, but has touched production and export facilities belonging to countries that aren't formally party to the U.S.-Iran conflict at all. That's part of why Gulf states beyond Iran and the United States have their own stake in how this de-escalates, or doesn't. Zoom out, and the shape of this becomes clearer. Since February, the pattern in the Strait of Hormuz has been escalation, ceasefire, blockade, brief opening, blockade again, a cycle that's repeated itself at least twice already this year. Congressional Research Service figures put the scale of the disruption in stark terms. During just the initial blockade phase through mid-June, CENTCOM redirected over 140 ships. Separate figures tied to the broader 2026 blockade effort describe roughly 3 ships seized outright, 85 vessels intercepted according to CENTCOM's own accounting, and a U.S. claim that the pressure is costing Iran on the order of $500 million a day. Though that dollar figure comes from a U.S. source and hasn't been independently verified by a neutral body. Iran, for its part, has responded in kind at times, seizing at least 2 cargo ships of its own in retaliation, according to the same tracking. The United States hasn't been managing this alone, and it hasn't always gotten the international backing it wanted. Early in the conflict, on March 15th, President Trump called on countries that receive oil shipped through the Strait of Hormuz to help protect that passage militarily. The response wasn't what Washington was hoping for. According to reporting compiled in open-source tracking of the crisis, a string of U.S.-aligned nations, including Germany, Spain, Italy, Estonia, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, along with the European Union itself, declined that specific request the very next day. That reluctance hasn't fully gone away. As recently as August 7th, Al Jazeera reported that Washington has spent months trying to build an international naval coalition to escort vessels through the strait, but that European allies, including the UK and France, countries that had earlier agreed in principle to lead such a mission if a durable truce took hold, were still hesitating to commit forces, even as the ongoing disruption continues to strain the global economy. That hesitation doesn't mean Europe has no presence in the region at all. There's actually a standing European maritime mission built for exactly this kind of moment. The European Maritime Awareness in the Strait of Hormuz, known as EMAS-OH, along with its military component, Operation Aginor. It was originally launched back in January 2020 by a coalition of European countries, including France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and others, specifically to protect freedom of navigation in the strait after an earlier round of tanker incidents. It operates in parallel with the older US-led international maritime security construct. Both frameworks existed years before this war started. They're part of the reason the region already had some machinery in place for coordinating with commercial shipping when this crisis hit, even if that machinery hasn't been enough, on its own, to keep the current situation from escalating as far as it has. Iran's own account of the war's opening days gives a sense of just how fast this moved. According to open-source tracking of the conflict, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps officially declared the strait closed to what it called unfriendly nations on March 2nd, just 2 days after the war began, allowing only Iran-approved vessels through. 2 days after that, on March 4th, the IRGC claimed its Navy had achieved what it called complete control of the strait. Some Iran-approved shipments, mostly petroleum bound for China and India, reportedly continued to move during that period, in some cases under military escort, though that detail comes from open-source conflict tracking, rather than an on-the-record U.S. or Iranian government statement, and should be treated as a reported claim rather than a fully confirmed fact. What hasn't happened, and this matters, is a direct ship-to-ship exchange of fire between a U.S. warship and an Iranian naval vessel during this specific phase of the conflict. The confirmed use of force so far has centered on disabling or boarding non-compliant commercial vessels, and the single drone shoot-down by USS Boxer in July. That's a meaningfully different situation than an open naval battle, even though the rhetoric on both sides, CENTCOM's mine warning, Iran's threat to target warships, has escalated well beyond where it stood back in the spring. It's also worth noting what the U.S. Maritime Administration told its own flagged vessels back in February, before any of this most recent escalation. Stay as far as possible from Iran's territorial waters without compromising navigational safety. And if Iranian forces do attempt to board a U.S.-flagged commercial ship, the crew should not forcibly resist. Refraining from resistance, the guidance specifically noted, does not imply consent to the boarding. That's a striking piece of guidance to have on record months before the current level of tension. And it tells you Washington was preparing for exactly this kind of standoff long before the mine warning or the latest Iranian threat. So where does that leave the Strait of Hormuz right now, heading into the middle of August? Restrictions are active. CENTCOM is actively enforcing them with marine aviation support from USS Boxer. Iran has, within the last week, issued its most pointed warning yet against U.S. warships specifically. And the number of ships being redirected, boarded, or disabled continues to climb, week over week, with no announced end date to the current restrictions. To be clear about sourcing here, the blockade timeline and vessel figures come primarily from U.S. Central Command's own public releases and from Congressional Research Service analysis of that data, along with contemporaneous reporting from NBC News, Bloomberg, and Al Jazeera. The most recent CENTCOM tally, as of August 6th, comes via Shafaq News reporting on CENTCOM's own statement. Iran's May 3rd and August 4th warnings come from Al Jazeera and Euronews respectively, both citing Iranian state media and named Iranian officials. The July 18th drone incident is described according to President Trump's own account, with Tehran's denial noted directly. That one remains a disputed claim, not a confirmed fact on both sides. The claimed $500 million a day cost to Iran is attributed to U.S. sources and should be read as a U.S. estimate, not an independently audited figure. The oil price and inflation figures come from research published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas and the Center for Economic Policy Research, alongside contemporaneous market reporting from Al Jazeera and Reuters. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve and OFAC licensing details come from the Congressional Research Service, the Government Accountability Office, and CNBC's reporting on federal energy data. The insurance figures come from S&P Global's Platts reporting. Al Jazeera, The National, and the World Economic Forum. The European Naval Coalition reporting comes from Al Jazeera's coverage published August 7th, where a figure is described as an estimate, a state media claim, or a single side's account. That description is intentional, and it means the number should be read with the same caution given to it here. It's also worth being honest about the parts of this story that are simply still moving. CENTCOM has not announced an end date for the current restrictions. There is no confirmed timetable for a European naval escort mission materializing beyond the caution reported this week. And Iran's parliamentary leadership has been explicit that it doesn't intend to let shipping through the Strait return to its pre-war arrangement, even if a broader ceasefire eventually holds. Any of those positions could shift quickly, and probably will, given how many times this same cycle, tension, blockade, brief opening, renewed tension, has already repeated itself since February. There's a broader question sitting underneath all of this, and it's not really about ship counts or mine warnings. It's about how long a choke point that carries a quarter of the world's oil can keep functioning as a contested corridor before something forces a different resolution, either a negotiated reopening or an incident serious enough to change the calculus on one side or the other. Nobody involved, publicly, is predicting which of those comes first. What's clear from the timeline alone is that neither side has treated the Strait of Hormuz as a side issue in this war. It has been a primary battlefield in its own right, fought not just with missiles and drones, but with insurance premiums, sanctions licenses, strategic reserves, and most days, nothing more dramatic than a radio call telling a merchant captain to turn around. What do you think happens next in the Strait of Hormuz? Does this settle into a long-term standoff, or is there a specific event that tips it one way or the other? Let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.